Hey, welcome to this. This video is a collection of Houdini tips and tricks. It is aimed at beginners. Now we don't cover everything. I don't cover the hotkey manager, for example, and I don't cover how to create custom pie menus. I have separate videos for that in my playlist. I will link those in the description. I will also make some of these available separately on YouTube in the Houdini tutorial playlist to make them easier for people to find, so you can watch, however you want. If you want to watch this video, jump to a particular part or chapter, or if you want to search and filter for the videos in YouTube or go through the playlist, they will be available in there as well. Okay, hope you find this useful. If you have something that you think a beginner would find useful, please post those in the comments below. And so with that out of the way, let's dive into the video. So let's take a quick look at how we would go about creating a new project. Firstly, we go to File, click on New Project. If you already have a location, then you can click Set Project. But here I'll just choose New Project. Then we can give it a name, specify the files that we want Houdini to create for us, and then click Accept. This will set the job variable for us. In some instances, that job variable tells Houdini where to find files on disk. Then you want to save your scene. So go to File and click Save As to save your scene. Next, you want to enable autosave in the Edit menu. Down here we have autosave. To set the preferences for that, go to Edit, Preferences, and then Save and Load options. Here we can set the save method such as overwrite file, make numbered backup, or increment file name. We have some options for autosave as well, so we can set how often the autosave will happen. Maybe I'll change that to 3 minutes, so every 3 minutes we'll get an autosave. We can also set the autosave method to overwrite file, increment file name, or make numbered backup. Here it states that we need to activate the autosave feature in the Edit menu, so that's why I am mentioning it here, because that might be important to you. You need to check whether that feature is actually enabled, and then here we can set how often we want Houdini to autosave. So we do have the primitive shapes in Houdini, the cube, the sphere, the torus, and so on, but sometimes we would like to have some more complex test geometry, maybe some humanoid character or something like that. And we do have some of that test geometry in Houdini. We can press Tab here in the viewport and then go to Utilities and then Test Geometry. And here we have some geometry to start our experiments with. We have the shader ball, for example, we have the pig head, and so on. Some of these may be familiar if you watch the Houdini release teasers, for example, on the Side Effects website. You can also search for that in the network view. Just press Tab and then go to your test geometry. You can maximize a pane by hovering your mouse cursor in the pane that you want to maximize and then press Ctrl B. You can also press this button, this square pane button, that's also going to maximize the pane. Or you can click on this drop down and the option to maximize the pane is right in there. Another shortcut is Alt and the apostrophe key. This is useful for when you are working in your scene and you are laying out your scene using interactive handles and tools and pie menus. Or when you are working in the network view, you can also maximize that and then see what's going on in there, because sometimes you can have many nodes in your network view, and to see what's going on at a glance, you may want to maximize that pane as well. You can hide the pane tabs if you want to free up some space in the user interface. Click on the pane tab operations menu, then navigate here to pane interface, and then we have the toggle to show the pane tabs here. Now where the tabs were, this bar will appear, so you can just left click on that to get the pane tabs back. We can also hide the network controls. Click on the pane tab operations menu, go to pane interface, and then select network controls. So in this way we can toggle the pane tabs and also the display of the network controls. To change how the shelf tools are displayed in the shelf, you can click on the shelf options. Then you have this display tools as subsection. We can set the display to small icons, which will save some space. Large icons, text only, small icons and text, and then also large icons and text. If we look at the Houdini interface at a glance, we will notice that many of these elements do take up quite a bit of screen space. such as the tabs, the sidebars, the main menu bar, the shelf. So we actually have the option to toggle those on and off to free up some screen space. To do this, we have the toggle Stowbars command that is in Edit, and down here, toggle Stowbars. We can notice the shortcut for that is Alt, Control and S. As we can see, that toggles many of those user interface elements that take up quite a bit of screen real estate. So this is useful if we simply want to focus on your work. If you are comfortable with hotkeys and maybe the pie menus and such, then this is a very handy command. I'll just toggle that again with Control, Alt and S. Sometimes there won't be enough space in a user interface element to display all of the options or tools that are available. And then you have to click on these buttons to the left or to the right of that element, such as here in the Polygon tab in the shelf, to reveal the different tools that are available. Now there's a shortcut for that. We can hover the mouse cursor in that user interface element, so in this case the shelf, and then you can scroll the middle mouse wheel to scroll those options. And the same is going to apply in other areas of the user interface, such as the menu bar at the top of the network editor, for example, and so on. So give that a try. That can save you some time when you are scrolling through a bunch of options or tools in the user interface. We can enable first-person navigation in Houdini. I enjoy this navigation method because it's quite similar to the Unreal Engine navigation. This fly-through mode lets you move the camera through the scene using movement keys, so WASD keys, with a mouse look, so you can look around with the mouse. Okay, to enable first-person navigation, we can go to the View tool and then click this button here to enable first-person navigation mode, or you can press the shortcut M. Now we get this crosshair in the center of our view, and we can left-click and drag to look around. We can use WASD to move forward, backwards, left and right. Press and hold Shift to temporarily increase the movement speed, or press and hold Control to temporarily decrease the movement speed. Right mouse button, click and drag, will pan or drag up and down to move vertically. What's interesting is we can double-click on some geometry in the scene view to jump the camera to that geometry. To change the movement speed, you can scroll the middle mouse button. You will notice it shows you in the scene view that you're increasing or decreasing the speed. You can press the Q key to move the viewport camera down and the E key to move the viewport camera up. There are some options available for this tool, so you can press the P key or you can go and click on this button to show the View Tool Preferences. So here we can enable the first-person navigation. We have a toggle for that. You can also lock vertical movement. This is useful if you want to simulate walking around on a ground plane, for example. And then you have other options such as the movement and turn speeds as well. So this navigation method again is very similar to the fly-through navigation method that we have in Unreal Engine, so you may prefer this. Give this a try. We can lock our scene view camera too and look through the cameras and lights in our scene. We can add some cameras and lights here in the Lights and Cameras tab in the shelf. You can also add a camera in the Cameras and Lights menu in the scene view. Okay, I'll add a camera and I'll put the focus where I want that to be. And maybe we want to add a light such as a spotlight. So I'll just navigate around a bit and I'll put a spotlight over here, for example. An area light or a spotlight. I'll just go for the spotlight for this demonstration. I'll disable this Enable in Viewport option just for right now for demonstration purposes. Now notice that when I navigate around, the camera is going to jump out of that view. So we get our scene view camera back. Alright, so how do we match our scene view camera with that light or camera view again? Well, we can go to the Lights and Cameras menu, this drop down. We have a sub menu here, Look Through, so I can look through a light, for example, or we can click on the camera. We can also left click and drag the camera or the light from the network view into the scene view, and that is also going to match the scene view camera with the light or the camera that we dragged in. By default, the scene view camera is not tied or locked to the camera or light, but we do have the option to do that. Alright, so how do we do this? Once we have matched the scene view camera with a light or a camera, that is going to show in the Lights and Cameras menu. So instead of displaying no cam, it's going to display the name of that light or camera. Then we can go into that lights and cameras menu and select tie view to camera or light. You can also click the lock button in the pane to the right here, or you can press the shortcut Ctrl and \. Now if we use the regular view keys to navigate the viewport, we will also move the camera or light that we are locked to. Okay, let's look at the lights and menus camera once more. We have a few more options. We can switch to the next slide or the previous slide, for example, or we can switch here to the native viewport camera. Alright, so that was a quick look at how we can match the scene view camera to a light or camera in our scene, and how we can lock that view, so that when we navigate, the camera or light is going to follow. When your viewport camera is matched with, or that is when we look through a camera or light in the scene, we have these handles, or basically these gizmos, that allow us to set the focus interactively using those handles. So they are very handy. But what happens if they don't show up for some reason? Now this can be a bit confusing for beginners, so that is why I have added this bonus section. For example, you could accidentally hit the escape key or do so purposefully to move to the view tool so that you can navigate your scene view. Now if we match our viewport camera with the spotlight or the camera, for example, those handles or widgets do not show up. Alright, so how can we see those handles again? Well, take a look at the toolbar, check to see if the view tool is active. You want to enable this show handle tool to actually see the handles in the viewer. You also want to select the object, so in this case the point light, for example. I'll select that. In this case I'll just switch by dragging that into the viewport. Now for example, if I switch to the camera and I don't have the camera object selected, that handle is also not going to show up. If I select the camera, that handle should show up. One way to avoid this issue is to enable the view tool temporarily. Instead of pressing escape or switching to the view tool, we can enable the view tool temporarily by pressing and holding Alt or the spacebar. That is when we want to navigate the viewport. When we let go of Alt or spacebar, that is going to switch back. We still have the show handles tool active. If for some reason the handle still does not show up, right click on the show handles tool, and here we have toggle, so we can toggle the handles that we want to show up in the viewport. The handle may simply be toggled off here, so you can just enable that in here as well. Right, I've demonstrated that we can drag and drop cameras and lights into the scene view, that is to match the native viewport camera with a light or a camera so that we can essentially look through that light or camera. Alright, now we also have the ability to lock the mouse cursor inside the network editor so that we don't accidentally drag nodes out of it. To do this, left click and hold on the node that you want to move around, and then press and hold space. And now I can drag that node around in my network as quickly as I want without worrying about the mouse going out of the network view. We can change the background color scheme of the scene view. We can do this by going into the display options. You can press D for that or click that button down here. Click on the background tab, and then at the top left here we have the color scheme. Personally, I prefer this dark gray color scheme. By default, notifications such as warnings and help tips are displayed directly in the viewport. Now we can change where we would like these to display. For example, we can display those in the status bar instead of here in the viewport. Alright, so let's go and change our preferences. Go to Edit, Preferences, and then Notifications. Change the notification area to status bar. Now for the help tip area, we can actually select Suppress to suppress those help tips, or we can set that to the status bar as well. I prefer to have those on, so I'll set that to the status bar. I will click Accept, and now those tips and warnings will show up in the status bar. By default, the pane headers in Houdini have a gray color. Now the pane header includes the pane tab and the path. Now we have the option to color pane headers based on the network context that we are viewing. To enable this option, go to Edit, Preferences, and General User Interface. Enable this color pane headers with network context option. Click Apply and Accept. Now these changes may take a second to reflect in the interface. The pane headers will change to the representative network. You will notice in the object level, for example, we have one color. Then if we go to the geometry context or to the material context, the color of the pane headers will change. When we hover the mouse cursor over an element in the user interface, such as these icons or buttons, such as here in the shelf for example, it takes a moment and then a tooltip displays, and that describes what that element in the user interface is or does. Now it does take a second for that tooltip to pop up, so what we can do is we can press and hold Ctrl, and that will give us the tooltip immediately. So as you can see, I hover over the elements in the shelf to the toolbar or the display options. And also what is useful is here in the network view, we have these elements such as the color palette, the shape palette, and as we can see, those tooltips display immediately. This is particularly useful as you are learning the software. You don't remember exactly where something is, you're in a hurry perhaps, maybe you don't remember the shortcut. Again, press and hold Ctrl and then hover over those interface elements. The tooltip will display immediately. We can split panes in Houdini. Let's say we need some extra panes. We can split the existing ones horizontally or vertically. For example, I will go into this pane menu. Here we can see these options to split the pane left and right or top and bottom. The shortcuts are Alt and opening bracket to split vertically and Alt closing bracket to split horizontally. Now we have this horizontal or vertical divider where we have split those panes. You can click in the center of that divider to swap the panes on either side of that divider. You can switch how those panes are divided, so currently we have a horizontal division between those two. So if we want to switch that to a vertical split, we can now press and hold Alt and left click on the center of that divider. Panes are unpinned by default, which means that they follow the current selection. For example, when you dive into a geometry container, so you switch from SOP context to the geometry context, you'll notice that the path in the 3D view also changes from SOP to geometry. Similarly, if we have a node selected, the parameter editor is going to update to show the parameters for that selected node. Now you can click this pin button, which means that this pane will not follow the selection. So it's basically going to stay in this context where it is. Now sometimes when you create certain tabs, Houdini is going to pin them. Since we have both of these bottom panes now set to the network view, Houdini will pin the one that we brought up because it assumes that you only need one pane to follow with the selection. To stay orientated in your 3D scene, we can draw an origin Gnomon. To do this, go into the display options. Then in the guides tab, we have this option, toggle the origin Gnomon, so I'll turn that on. And now we get this Gnomon show up at the center of our world. You can draw a pivot which is going to indicate the location about which the view rotates when tumbling. So again, we can go into the display options in the guides tab and enable this here view pivot. Now in the 3D scene view, that view pivot is indicated by the small red circle in the view tool, or if you press and hold space and left mouse button click and drag to tumble, it will set that view pivot. Tracking with the middle mouse button will move that view pivot along, and left mouse button clicking in empty space won't place the pivot there, so it's only going to place it if you click on an object or some geometry. Right click on the view tool for a few options. If you set this to keep pivot, the pivot is not going to change when you left mouse button click on an object to tumble. Now in either mode we have a shortcut to set the viewport pivot, and that is Z while the view tool is active, otherwise press space Z. And notice here for example that is going to set the view pivot on this guy's head here, or back here on the sphere. So it really depends on how you want to work. So this is then going to have the effect of tumbling around the center of the view. We have some preferences that we can set for this. So navigate to Edit, Preferences, and then 3D Viewports. Okay, so in here you can toggle Use Alt for view controls, for example. You can toggle the default tumble pivot, such as keep pivot on tumble, set pivot on tumble, and so on. To home up on all objects in the scene, press space H. To home up on a selected object, press space G. Now if you have the view tool active, so you can just press escape and that is going to switch to the view tool. You can just press H for home all and G for home selected. Now if you have the construction plane active and you press space H, you will notice that that is actually going to home up on the construction plane. You'll notice that in the tip section it says home C plane. So again, if we use that, that is going to home up on the construction plane instead of on all objects. But that's fine, we have another shortcut, and that is space and then Shift A. If again you have the view tool active, you can just press Shift and A, and that is for home all, so that's going to home up on all of the objects. You also actually have Shift H to home up on a selected object. So again, spacebar, Shift H, or in the View tool, Shift H to home up on a selected object. In the View Options menu, you have these options, Home All, Home Selected, and so on. You also have a few options for framing, so you can frame the selected, frame all, and so on. We can store or basically bookmark views in the 3D scene view. This is useful if we find ourselves having to navigate back and forth between a few commonly used views in the viewport. To save a view, you can press and hold space, or just make sure that you are in the View tool, so press Escape for that. Otherwise, press and hold space and then press Ctrl and then 6 through to 9. So for this example, I will press and hold space and then press Ctrl and 6 to capture this quick view. Then I will navigate over here to this model. Before I capture the second quick view, I will switch the shading mode to wireframe. You can actually just press W for that. But just as an example, maybe I switch the shading view here, then again press and hold space, and then press Ctrl and 7. Now we can recall or get back to those views using hotkeys, and those will be the numbers that we used for the quick views. So for example, I will press and hold space and press 6 to get back to that first view that I had captured. Space and 7 will take me back to the second quick view. Now notice that saving a quick view is also going to save everything about that view at the moment, including the shading mode. Use quick views to store and recall frequently used views in the 3D viewport. The tag visualizer displays a selectable label pointing to an object in the 3D viewer. This can be useful to annotate objects in the scene, or to make it easier to see and to select objects in a crowded scene, or if the object is far away from the viewport camera. To add a tag visualizer, right-click on the Visualizers button, the toolbar to the right of the scene view. Since this is a scene visualizer, click the plus button to the right of Scene and click on Tag. That should now add the visualizer and enable it so we can see those labels in the viewer. Let's look at some of the parameters. In the Style dropdown, we can choose whether the tag contains text, an icon only, or both. In the Behavior tab, we can choose the preferred placement. Do we want that label tag to be to the left of the object, to the top of the object? We have an option to keep the tag in the viewport. With that option enabled, the tag will display even when the object is not in view. In the Appearance tab, you can change the font size, the icon size, whether you want to show a bounding box of the tagged object. Here, for example, this object is actually one object, so you can see the bounding box that gets displayed. You can also toggle whether or not you want to show a back panel for the tag. And you have a few options for the back panel. You can change the color and the corner radius, for example. If you want, you can change the name and the label of this tag. You can click this button to add this visualizer to the viewport toolbar for quick access. Now this button will display in the viewport toolbar. You can left click on that to toggle the visualizer. You can right click on that and click Edit to bring that Edit Visualizer window back up, or you can select Remove to remove that button here. Now that's not going to remove the visualizer, that is still available in the Visualizers menu. So right click on the Visualizers button, and then under the Scene section, our tag Scene Visualizer will show up. You can toggle that by clicking the checkbox to the left. You can right click on the tag and select Duplicate or Delete, and you can edit that visualizer by clicking the pencil button to the right. Again, that's going to bring up that Edit Visualizer window again. Now we can also remove or delete tags in this Edit Visualizer window. In the top left corner, you will see this X, so we can click on that to delete the visualizer. Just make sure to click only once, because the next one in the stack will basically show up in here, and you don't want to accidentally delete that. You can also add tags to specific objects. For example, I will select this pig head, then right click on the Visualizer button again, go and add another Scene tag. With that object selected, it will show up in this pane to the right here. So I can now left click and drag that tag onto the pig head. Notice that that tag now displays for the pig head. Alright, and that was a quick introduction to tags in Houdini. To bring up some documentation on a specific node, we can select the node, go to the parameters, and then click on this button here with the question mark. Again, that's going to bring up a browser with the documentation. We can also right click on the node and then click Help. That will also bring up some documentation on that particular node, in this case the poly extrude. Let's look at a few navigation shortcuts in the network. We can double click on a node to navigate into that node. You will see the navigation shows up in this bar. You can also press enter with that node selected, and that's going to navigate into that node. And with a node selected, I can press I to dive into the node. The shortcut U will jump out of a node or navigate up one level. These options are also available in the Go menu. We also have a Radial menu for network editor navigation. You can bring that up with the N key. With this, we can jump up and jump down. And this is also a quick way to get to different contexts. Maybe we want to go back to the object level or materials, for example. So this is a quick way to navigate in the network editor. So I've added a material to my object, and I'm in this material context now. And notice that in the scene viewer, we are in the object context. Instead of clicking this drop down and then searching for the level, the context that I want to go to, such as object again, since my 3D scene view is already in the object context, I can use the sync button. We have the sync button right here. So if I left click and drag on that and I drop that into the network pane, it's going to set the path in the network pane to the object context. We have shortcuts to zoom to show all of the nodes, or to zoom to show the selected nodes in the network. If we want to zoom to show all of the nodes, or to basically home up on all of the nodes, we have the shortcut H. And to zoom to show all of the selected nodes, with a few nodes selected, we can press the G key. These options are available in the View menu. You can see we have zoom to show all and zoom to show selected. We can change the wiring style. By default it is set to straight, but we can press Shift and S to toggle that. So if I press that, we get this rounded wiring style. That option is also available in the View menu, right here, Change Network Wiring Style. Now we can select multiple nodes and left click and drag on one of them to move those selected nodes where we want them, but we also have some shortcuts. For example, we can press and hold Shift and left mouse button click and drag on a node, and it can then move that node and the upstream nodes, so its inputs along with it. Or you can press and hold Control, left mouse button click and drag on a node, and that's going to move that node and the downstream nodes. I will drop down a merge node. Now instead of wiring the outputs of each one of these transform nodes into the input of the merge node one by one, what I can do instead is I can select all three of the transform nodes, left click or left click and hold and drag off from one of the outputs, and then simply wire that into the merge node. You can also do this with other nodes such as the Boolean node. Houdini will attempt to wire those up, but the inputs may not be in the order that you want, so there is a shortcut that will allow you to rotate the inputs instead of having to rewire those manually. We have a shortcut that will allow us to reorder a selected node's inputs. And that's useful because that means that we don't have to rewire the inputs into that node manually by cutting them and rewiring them. In this example, I'm performing a Boolean subtract operation. I have these two boxes, and I'm performing this Boolean operation to those. And so we get this result. Now we can press Shift and R, and that's going to reorder the selected node's inputs. And now we get this result. So maybe this is the shape that I'm actually going for. This option is also available in the Edit menu as Rotate Input Connections. Instead of placing the merge node down and then wiring things up, I will select these three nodes here and then drag off to start a wire, either left clicking once and then we get the wire, or left clicking and dragging, and then I can press and hold Alt and then left click to get a merge node. You can also press and hold Alt, left mouse button click and hold on an output to get a wire, and then as soon as you let go, that'll place down a merge node. We can also cut across wires to sever them using a knife tool, which basically allows us to draw across wires that we want to sever. For example, let's say we want to cut these wires down here that goes into the merge node. We can press and hold the Y key. Notice that the mouse cursor turns into these scissors. Now if I left click and drag, it draws out this red to indicate where we are cutting, and we can cut across those wires that we want to sever. So we can cut across multiple wires or just the wires that we want to cut with that hotkey. A few other ways to disconnect wires: you can right click on a wire and then click disconnect. You can also click on a wire and just press delete. You can left click and drag off of an input, and that will also disconnect the wire. Or you can shake out the node. So left click and hold on the node and shake it out. What's useful with the shake method is when you shake the node out, you don't lose your wiring, so Houdini will wire the upstream and downstream nodes together basically, so you don't have to rewire everything. Let's look at how we can insert a node into an existing wire. Instead of wiring up the nodes one by one from an output into an input, or dragging off, press tab, search for a node, place that down and then wire that up, what we can do is we can insert a node into an existing wire. One way of doing this is you can right click on an output or an input, depending on the input. So let's just start here with this box 1, for example. Right click on the output, and then for this example I'll search for transform, press enter, and that is going to drop that node into the existing wire. We can also right click on a wire to get the context menu and then select insert node, and here maybe I'll insert a color node, for example. You can also select a wire. So here with this wire selected, I will press tab, maybe search for another color node and left click to place that down, and that is already wired up for us. As I mentioned, you can also right click on an input to place a node, and as you can see we get a preview of the wiring, so that will get placed and wired up for us. But in this case I'll just press escape to cancel that operation. Because I already have this transform node to the right here, I'll just drag that, and now I can drop that on this existing wire. Houdini will show us what the wiring will look like, and we can see that it will wire that node in for us. So if I let go to drop that node onto that wire, Houdini will wire that up for me. Okay, so that's a few ways of how we can insert a node into an existing wire. We have a shortcut for copying nodes. For example, instead of doing Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V, or Ctrl-D to duplicate, we can copy a node or multiple selected nodes by pressing and holding Alt, and then we can left click and drag on the node that we want to copy, and that is going to make a copy of them. And that also works in other contexts, not just in the object context. So we can see here in the geometry context, for example. Again, press and hold Alt and left mouse button, click and drag on the node or selected nodes that you want to copy. So we can copy multiple selected nodes by selecting them and then pressing and holding Alt and then left mouse button clicking and dragging on one of them to copy all of those selected nodes. But there's another few shortcuts, so we can press and hold Alt and Shift and then left click and drag on a node to create a copy of that node and the upstream nodes. For example, if I want to duplicate the merge node and all of the upstream nodes, so the nodes that are fed into its input, I can press and hold Alt and Shift and the left mouse button click and drag on the merge node, and as you can see that's going to duplicate the merge node and all of its inputs, so the upstream nodes. Similarly, we can press and hold Ctrl, Alt and left mouse button click and drag on a node, which will duplicate the node that you have clicked on and all of the downstream nodes. We can change the color of a node, and that is particularly useful when we are zoomed out and we want to spot a node at a glance. To bring up the color palette, click on this button or press the C key. We can resize the palette by clicking on its edges or in the corner. We can left click and drag and drop a color onto a node, or we can select a node and then click on the color that we want to set that to. You can right click on a node, go to Actions, and then select Use Default Color to revert the node color. You can also go to the Tools menu, and then here you have the Show Palette subsection, where you can click None, or you can show the color palette, for example, or the Shapes palette. If you want a node to stand out, you can change its shape. Let's begin by bringing up the Shape palette, clicking this button, or you can use the shortcut Z. Now we can left click and drag and drop the shape that we want onto a node, or with the node selected, you can click the shape that you want, which will also change the shape of the node. You can resize the shape palette by left clicking and dragging on the edges of that palette or in the top left corner. In the Tools menu, we have the Show Palette subsection where you can toggle that as well. So you can toggle the Shape Palette switch back to none, or you can toggle the color palette as well. In the View menu, you can toggle the display of custom shapes, and you can right-click on a node, go to Actions, and select Use Default Shape, and that's going to use the default shape for that node. We have a Network Overview palette, which is a small representation of the current network. We can bring that up pressing the O key. We can click or click and drag in this overview panel to quickly navigate the network. Again, this in combination with node colors is also useful. As you can see, those colors show up in the network overview panel as well. So this makes it easier to navigate large, more complicated networks. One feature that assists in the organization of our networks is network dots. You can use dots to make wires follow a specific route. This can be useful if you have long wires. To add a dot, hold Alt and then left mouse button click on the wire. Now you'll notice that we can align these network dots as well, so we can align those to each other or to the nodes in the network. Now notice that when I delete this merge node down here, it will sever the wires, but it will also delete the dots that we had placed down. So we may not want that, we may want the dots to remain. So we can pin a dot by Alt left mouse button clicking on the dot. You will notice the dot changes slightly to indicate that it is pinned. And now if we delete the merge node down here, notice that those dots remain behind. Also notice that these dots have inputs and outputs, so I can select them, drag out from one of the outputs, press and hold Alt left mouse button click to drop down a merge node. So this allows us to keep wiring from the dot position. We don't have to go back up to the node to wire. We can add dots as we wire, so not just after the fact to existing wires. So we can create a new wire by clicking the output or input of a node, which will give us this wire. Then press and hold Alt and left mouse button click to add the dot. Another interesting thing is we can add color to dots. So bring up the color palette and then click and drag a color onto the dots. So this helps with readability in the network. We can gather multiple wires into a dot to help clean up our graph. In this example, these transform nodes all share the same input, so that means we can gather those into a dot. To do this, I will press and hold Alt and then left click and drag on that wire to start bundling those wires together into a dot. This is another fun one. We can basically draw across nodes or connectors to wire them together. So for this example, I'll press and hold Y and then I'll just cut those wires again. And let's say I want to quickly wire those back up. You can press and hold J and then left click to draw those wires. So drag across nodes or connectors to wire them together. So we do have the node ring, which is very useful for setting flags on nodes. You can just hover over a node and the node ring will come up and you can click to set the different flags. This is also useful if you are zoomed out, where it's difficult to click on the flags on the node itself. Now we do have hotkeys for the different flags, and so we'll talk about those in this section. Let's start with the display flag. The shortcut for that is R. So you can press and hold R and then you can left click on a node where you want to set the flag, or you can press and hold R and drag out a box over the node where you want to set that flag. Or with a node selected, you can also press R to set the flag. What's great about this is that you can press and hold R and left click anywhere on the node, and that will set a flag, so in this example the display flag, without worrying about where you click. So it will not accidentally toggle another flag when you do that. Or again, you can do a drag out a box selection, holding R, and that will also set the display flag. QOB is for the bypass flag, which is going to disable the node. Now the input geometry is going to pass through the node to the output unchanged, which is useful for testing. The shortcut E is for the template flag, which will make the geometry visible, even if that node does not have the display flag set. T allows us to set the render flag on the node, and you will notice where the display flag usually goes, that rightmost bar on the node will be set to this purple color instead of blue. And we have this purple circle around the node as well. So usually the render flag is set to whatever we have the display flag on, right? But you can separate those two out. So you can set one node to provide the geometry in the viewer. You want that to be displayed in the 3D view. And then you can set the render flag on another node, and that geometry will then show up at render time. I'd also like to mention that you can right click on a node, and that will also give you a flags menu where you can set the flags. We can change how template geometry shows up in the 3D scene view. I will go to display options. You can press D for that in the scene view as well. Firstly, I will go to the guides tab, and here we can toggle template geometry. In the marker section in set display options 4, I will switch to template model geometry. Here we can set that to something else. By default it is set to wireframe, but we can change that in here in this drop down. Alright, I'll just set that back to wireframe. You can press page up to select the upstream node, that is the node connected to the input of the currently selected node. Page down will select the downstream node, that is the node that is connected to the output of the currently selected node. And then shift page up will select the previous sibling node, and page down will select the next sibling node. Use these shortcuts in combination with the node flag shortcuts to step through your network. Instead of pressing enter when we place down a node, we can press shift enter, and that will place down the node, and it will also set the display flag. For example, let's say I right click on the output of this node here, and I search for something and I place that down, or press enter to place that down. That is not going to set the display flag, but if I press shift and enter, it will place the node down, but it will also set the display flag, and that is going to save a click. Now one interesting thing is, let's say I don't have a wire from that output, I just have the node selected. I will press tab, start searching for the node, transform for example, and then I'll press shift and enter, and notice that it's actually going to wire that in for us as well. Whereas if we were to just place that down, we would have to wire that up manually after the fact. When we are close up to our nodes in the network editor, when we home up on them or zoom up on them, it's easy to click on the output of a node to get a wire, to then wire that into the input of another node. But there's a trick that I'd like to show you, and that is holding the Alt button. We can left mouse button click on a node, and now we get a list of inputs and outputs on that node. So here I can select the output of this node, click on the boolean, and then wire that into the first input of that node. Same here with the second box. Press and hold Alt left mouse button click on that, select the output of that node, press and hold Alt left mouse button click on the boolean operation again, and we can now select the second input on that boolean operation. And so with this shortcut we can make connections even when we are zoomed out. We have maybe a lot going on in our network. So we can align and lay out nodes manually, but we do have a few options that can speed up that process. Here for example, with these nodes selected, we can see that they are not aligned and they are not spaced. So in the layouts menu, I can select align vertically, and that is going to align those nodes. And I can select distribute nodes vertically to distribute those or evenly space them out. We have similar options for horizontal layout, alignment and distribution. We have some shortcuts for these operations. For example, with these nodes selected, I will press and hold Alt and A and left click and drag up from that bottom node. That will distribute the nodes vertically. We can also press Shift and A and drag horizontally or vertically. In this case, I'll just go vertically to align these nodes. Again, this also works horizontally. So Alt and A, left click and drag to distribute these nodes. Shift and A, left click and drag to align the nodes. These alignment and distribution options are useful at the object level as well, where the nodes are not connected, so you select them and then perform those operations. But there's one more option in Houdini, and that is the layout operation, which is especially useful in the case where you do not have nodes selected, but they are wired together so they are connected. Alright, so let's take a look at that. We can also perform a layout operation upstream or downstream from a node. For example, over here I will press and hold A, left click and drag up to lay out those upstream nodes vertically, or this one, press and hold A, left mouse button click and drag down to lay out the downstream nodes. If you have some nodes selected, it's only going to affect those nodes. If I press an Alt A and left click and drag to the left, it's going to lay out those upstream nodes horizontally. Same thing if I press an Alt A key, left mouse button, click and drag to the right, it's going to lay out the downstream nodes horizontally like this. This is a quick way to lay out your nodes. Again, just press an Alt A, left mouse button, click and drag from the node where you want to begin the layout operation. You also have those options in the layout menu. You can lay out nodes up, lay out nodes down, layout nodes left, layout nodes right. You also have the layout all option, but that may do things that you may not want. And especially if you have a large network, that may lay things out in a way that you do not want. Okay, so that is a quick introduction to how we can lay nodes out, how we can distribute and align nodes in a quick way in the network editor. Here you can see the difference between the alignment, distribution and layout options. Align, for example, will attempt to keep the overall distance from the first node to the last and align the rest of the nodes in between that distance. Layout will not keep that distance. Also notice that the node that you click on when you perform the alignment operation will act as a sort of anchor. The other nodes will align based on where that node is located in the network. When we search for a tool in the tab menu, we can restrict the search by clicking on the category. So for example, in the network view, I'll press tab and then I'll start searching. Now, as I type that out, I also get some things that I don't want, such as this guide simulate, for example. So what I can do is I can left click on this characters category. And if I type now, it's going to restrict the search to that category. Similarly, in the 3D viewer, if I start searching for something, so I'll press tab, start searching for simple SIM, for example, it's going to bring up a bunch of things. So I can left click on the characters category, and now if I search, that is going to restrict the search to that category. Okay, so that is handy when you're trying to search for something. A lot of options come up that may not be particularly relevant to what you're trying to do. And so in this way, we can simply click on a category to restrict the search. Network boxes allow you to group nodes together. They allow you to highlight a group of nodes. You can even color the network box. And what's great is you can minimize the network box with a bunch of nodes in there to hide parts of the network. Now we can add a network box and then drag the nodes that we want to add to that into the network box, but I'll begin here by selecting these two nodes, and then I'll click on this button to add a network box, and that's going to put those two nodes in a network box. Alright, so I'll do this with the rest of the nodes. So I'll select these nodes, click the network box button again, and now it's going to group all of these nodes in this network box. The shortcut to add a network box is Shift-O. You can also add titles to your network boxes. Double-click in the top bar of the box and then add some title. Now, as you can see, we can embed network boxes inside other network boxes, and you can actually also add sticky nodes in network boxes. You can minimize or collapse a network box by clicking on this button at the top left corner. As you can see, that is going to hide this part of our network. It collapses the nodes, it collapses the other network boxes that are in there as well. The icon now changes, it's a plus now, so click on that and that will expand or maximize this network box again. You can also press Shift and J to collapse or minimize a box, or Shift and K to restore or expand the box. If you hold Control when you click on the Minimize and Restore button in the top left corner of the network box, Houdini will move the nodes that are around the network box to account for the size of the box. Moving the network box will move the nodes that are inside of it. Just like with nodes, we can define a color for them, so we can bring up the color palette, and with the network box selected, we can click a color, or you can drag and drop a color from the color palette onto the network box to assign a color to it. Left click and hold on the node to drag it around, and if I now drag towards the edge of the box, it's going to resize the box. Dragging it quickly will remove the node from the box. You can also just select nodes and drag those into the box where you want those to be. To remove a box, select it and then press delete. Now in this way your nodes are going to stay behind. In some cases you may want to remove the network box and its contents. Alright, so to remove a box and everything inside of it, select it and then press Shift Delete. To resize a network box, we can left click and drag on the edges or the corners. Now instead of manually trying to make the network box fit our nodes again, we have a command that will resize the network box to fit the nodes. The shortcut for that is Shift-M. So with the network box selected, press Shift M, and as you can see, that is going to resize the box to fit the nodes. Alright, some of these options are also in the menu bar. In the Add menu, for example, we can add a network box, and then we can simply drag or cut and paste the nodes that we want into that box. In the Layout dropdown, we have the option to resize the network box to fit the nodes, and we have the other shortcuts that I mentioned as well to collapse or minimize the box, or to restore or expand the box as well. Those are Minimize selected and Restore selected, Shift J and Shift K. We can also add sticky notes to the network. These are boxes of text that explain parts of the network to other people working on the same project or team, or to yourself for future reference. To add a sticky note, click on this button or press Shift P. You can also click on Add in the menu bar and then select Sticky Note. Click in the body to add your text or to edit the contents of the note. When the sticky note is not needed, we can collapse or minimize it. Collapse or restore the sticky note by clicking the Minimize and Restore button to the left of the top bar. With the note selected, you can also press Shift J to collapse or minimize the box and Shift K to restore or expand the box. We can also set the size of the text by right-clicking to get the context menu, and then you have a few options in here to minimize and so on. And down here we have the Set Text Size. As well, set that to medium, for example. And of course, we can move the sticky notes around where we want that by simply left-clicking and dragging on the top bar. We can also assign a color to the sticky note itself and also to the text in the body of the sticky note. Okay, so I'll bring up the color palette and then drag and drop a color onto the bar on the top bar of the sticky note to set a color for the sticky note itself. Drag and drop a color onto the body to set the color of the text in the body of the sticky note. We can also hide the body of the sticky note if we want to use the text as a sort of label in the network editor. Right-click on the box and select Hide Background. Now we can still left-click and drag to move that box around. And now we can use this as a sort of label in the network editor. With the box selected, we'll see a faint outline of where that is. And we can right-click for the context menu again and then select Draw, Sticky Note, Background to draw the background of the sticky note again. Alright, so that was a quick introduction to sticky notes in Houdini. Sometimes when you attempt to make a selection in the network editor, the node ring can be in your way, or you might accidentally click and set a flag, or you might move a node because you click and drag on it when you attempt to start a box selection. Now you can hold the S key to enter a selection mode in the network editor. While you hold the S key down, clicking and dragging will only select. While you hold down S, press and hold Shift to add to the selection. Also, while you hold S, you can press and hold Ctrl to remove from the selection. This makes it easy to select nodes without worrying about moving the node or accidentally clicking wires or flags. When you navigate in the network editor, you can middle mouse button click and drag to pan. Right mouse button and click and drag will zoom. And of course, if you left click, that is going to select or drag out a box selection. Now, when you navigate in this way, you could accidentally middle mouse button click on a node, which will bring up the node info window. Or if you right mouse button click on a node when you attempt to zoom, that might bring up the context menu. So to avoid this, we can hold the spacebar key to enter a navigation mode. Holding space and then left mouse button and clicking and dragging, or middle mouse button clicking and dragging will pan. Holding space and right mouse button clicking and dragging will zoom as before. But in this mode, we can even click on the nodes and still navigate without worrying about selecting and moving nodes accidentally or bringing up info windows or context menus. Network editor Quickmarks allow us to capture a location in the network that we can return to or switch back and forth between, which will save some time in navigation. So I'll navigate into this box, for example, and then press Ctrl 1 through to 5 to set a Quickmark location, which again will capture this location so that we can return to it. In this case, I'll do Ctrl 1. You can set or jump to Quickmarks in the Go menu, or you can use shortcuts. So here in the Go menu, you can see under Set Quickmarks, I have already set one for Ctrl 1. And then here we can also jump to the Quickmarks. Alright, I will navigate to the torus geometry and set another Quickmark over here, Quickmark 2. And maybe I will go over to the material context, set a Quickmark, Quickmark 3. To return to a Quickmark location in the network, press the corresponding number, that is for Quickmark 1 through to 5. So that is without control, just press the number. So 1 was originally in the cube geometry location, Quickmark 2 was the torus, and then I also set a Quickmark location in a different context, in the material context, Quickmark 3. So again, this lets you jump between different locations in the network editor, even in different contexts. You can also press the backtick key to jump back and forth between the current and the previous location. Let's look at how we can add or remove tools from a shelf tab. For example, I will go into the Deform tab, right-click on Morph, and then I can select Remove from Shelf. We can also right-click on the shelf here in the empty space and select Edit Shelf tab. That will bring up this Edit Shelf window. In the Tools tab, notice that the tools that are in that tab will be highlighted. So let's say I want to remove the Bulge subtool. I can click on that to make sure it is not highlighted and click Apply. If I want to add a tool, again, I just make sure that it is highlighted, click Apply and Accept. We can edit shelf sets in a similar way. Click on the Shelf menu and then select Edit Shelf Set. The Deform Shelf tab is selected, so if I click on that to make sure that it is not highlighted or selected and click Apply, it will remove that shelf tab from the shelf set. If I want to add a shelf tab to the shelf set, select it and make sure it is highlighted and click Apply and Accept, and notice that it will add that shelf tab to the shelf set. Another quick way to add shelf tabs to a shelf is to click on the plus button in the Tabs section, then navigate to the Shelves section, and here you will have a list of predefined shelves. Okay, so you can add or remove Deform, for example, and you will see which ones are added to the shelf set when they have a checked checkbox. We can create a new shelf tab that we can name and add the tools that we want to that. You can click on the Add Tab menu, that plus button next to the tabs, and then select New Shelf tab, or this drop-down menu, the Shelf Pane menu, and then select New Shelf tab. An Edit Shelf window will appear, and in the Options tab, we can give the shelf a label, and then in the Tools tab, we can select the tools that we want to have in that tab, as I've mentioned before. So here I will select the Box SOP, for example, and maybe the Bulge SOP as well. Click Apply, and notice that those tools will now appear in your custom shelf. To edit the shelf, you can right-click on the shelf and then simply select Edit Shelf. And again, now we can change the name or add tools to it. We can left-click and drag and drop that shelf where we want that, even into other shelf sets. And now we can left-click and drag some of the tools that you want from other shelf tabs. So left-click and drag and drop those into this shelf tab. So here the shell system, for example, left-click and drag and drop that and put that where you want. You can also organize the tools that are in that shelf tab by simply left-clicking and dragging on those and placing those where you want them. We can also add custom shelf tools to a shelf tab. For example, let's say I have some nodes that I want to reuse over and over in a project. This geometry, for example, let's say I'm going to use that multiple times, or I prefer to have this as a starting point in addition to some of the other options. I will go back to the object level and give this node a name, and then I will simply left-click and drag that and drop that into the shelf. To use that tool again, I can click on that in the shelf, or I can press Tab. So here in the network view, for example, in the More section, I have my box, my custom tool, or you can search for that, or in the viewer, press Tab, search for that, and press Enter. Because if you have some setup that you like to reuse, then this is one way of wrapping that up into a reusable tool. This depends on the context, because, for example, I can select these two nodes, drag and drop those into the Pane tab, and then we get this window, Create Shelf Tool, where we can create a new tool from the dragged nodes. In here we can give the tool a name and label. We can choose an icon, choose the input and the output node, and I'll click Accept. Now let's say we start with an empty geometry container. I'll jump into that node. I know that I'm in the geometry context. I can press Tab and search for that tool, or I can select it in the Shelf tab. Now this is one way of creating tools, but you also have a feature in Houdini called Recipes, and we'll look at that next. We have a feature in Houdini called Recipes, which allows us to save parameter settings and groups of nodes so that you can recreate them when you need them. We can save out a node's parameters as a recipe, or you can save out selected nodes that you want to reuse in your project as a recipe, things like lighting setups and stuff like that. So I'll just do a few simple examples here. Let's begin by looking at how you can save a node preset. So let's say we have some SOP. In this example, I'll just use this box SOP, and I will make some changes to the parameters. For example, the axis divisions and the size. So now we can save those parameter values as a recipe. Once saved, we can apply this recipe to other box nodes. To save the parameter values as a preset or a recipe, click on the recipe button and then select Save Node Preset, or right-click on the node, go to Recipes and select Save Node Preset. The Save Node Preset window comes up. In here you can choose which parameters you want to save or capture. For example, I want to capture the size and the axis divisions. We have to give this a name, so I'll name this box demo, for example. You can set the location where you want to save this recipe, such as user preferences. You can also capture keyframes and expressions. I will uncheck that for this because I don't need that for this. You also have a checkbox to select all parameters. I don't care to capture all parameters here, so I'll uncheck that and make sure only to check those that I want to capture. Alright, so let's say we want to make some changes. Let's say, for example, I want to increase the axis divisions. To do that, you can make the modification on the parameter. So in this example, I will change axis divisions from 3 to 4, then click Reload Values, and that will then update in this window as well for the property that we are trying to capture. Click Save to save that recipe. And now if we drop in another box, dive into that and select the box SOP node, we can click on the recipe button and that recipe will now show up. So we can select that and it's going to apply the parameters. You can also right-click on the node, go to Recipes, and then select your recipe from the list. I will delete all of these boxes in the scene because I want to show you what will happen when you choose to edit the contents of a recipe. If we want to delete, rename, or edit the contents of a recipe, we can go to the Recipe Manager, that is in the Windows menu, Recipe Manager. You can filter and search. For example, we can show only the node presets, and we can type a name. So let's say we know what the name is of our preset, of our recipe. So here we can select that, and then we can delete, or we can rename that in here as well, or we can click Edit Contents. When you choose to edit the contents of a recipe, Houdini will temporarily create the contents, and it's going to open up the recipe editor. So now with a box selected, for example, you can change some of the parameters again, and now again we can choose which parameters to capture, and you can click Reload Values, which will then capture the values that you have changed in the parameter editor. Save your changes when you are done. And you can just go and check to see if that works. So right-click on the node, Recipes, choose that preset, and we can notice that the changes did reflect. So we successfully made some edits to our recipe. We also have tool recipes in Houdini. A tool recipe is going to save a node or a set of nodes, including their wiring and current parameter values, as a new tool. What's useful about this is you can then access that tool in the tab menu when you want to recreate that saved node setup. So just a simple example, let's say I want to save this box here with some subdivisions on it. Maybe I'm going to reuse this multiple times in my project. Right-click on it, go to Recipes, and then select Save Selected Item as Tool. The node that you right-click on becomes the anchor of the node recipe. So when you drop in the recipe, the other nodes will be positioned relative to the anchor node. Don't worry about it if you forget about this for a second when you right-click and decide to make a tool out of some selected nodes, because you can also set the anchor in the dialog that comes up. The Save Tool window will show up, so I will give the recipe a name. You can choose the tab submenu where this tool will appear. You can choose a custom icon if you want. So for example, I'll just search for cube and select one of these and click Accept. And you can change where you want to save that recipe to. You can also select the anchor. You can select this in this menu, or you can actually right-click on the node. And you should be able to select the anchor in the context menu that comes up as well. I will create a new empty geometry container, and then in here I can now press Tab, and then in the recipe section my tool will appear. We get both of those nodes now. Just for demonstration purposes, I will delete this geometry again, go to Window and Recipe Manager. I will find that recipe and click Edit. And now we can make some modifications to the recipe. So on the subdivide node, I will set the depth to 4, for example. And now maybe we want to add another node to this recipe. Well, I'll just go and work as usual. I will add maybe a color node or a transform or something like that for demonstration purposes. Maybe I'll set the color on this. I will select those nodes and click Reload Selection. That node will now show up in the recipe editor along with the other nodes. Save that recipe, create a geometry node, and then in here I will use that tool. And as you can see, it places down the box geometry, the modified subdivide node with the depth that we had set to 4, and the color node. So again, you don't have to create a new tool each time, because this allows you to edit your existing tool. We also have a decoration recipe. Now this is similar to a tool recipe, but you designate one node in the recipe as a central node. The central node is the node that we want to apply the recipe to in the network. I will select these nodes and right click on it, and recipes, save selected items as decoration. In this dialog, I will give the recipe a name. We can see which node is the central node. It will be highlighted in the illustration. So I will apply this to a different setup. So let's say I have this box here, for example. I will drop down a subdivide node. The subdivide is what we want to target for our recipe. So I can right click on the subdivide node and then select that recipe. So that will be the starting point. It's going to replace that with our recipe central node. And notice we get the rest of the nodes here as well. So we can just left click to place those down. With the node selected, you can also find that in the recipes menu when you click the recipes button in the parameters editor, for example. So that was a quick introduction to recipes in Houdini. Of course, you can do complicated stuff with this. So let's say you are in Solaris and you have a 3-point lighting setup that you like, for example, with your render nodes and everything. Then you can simply select those and save those out as a recipe instead of having to redo that setup each time. Houdini has predefined desktop layouts, but we may want to save a custom desktop configuration. So for example, we can add some shelves, such as maybe I want the terrain tools. Maybe I want to close off this pane that has the parameter editor, because I can simply bring up the parameter pane in the network editor as I'm working. So after a work session, I may have made some of these modifications to the modeling desktop preset. Now I have a few options. I can either save this out as a custom desktop, or I can revert to the previous or preset layout. So click on the desktop list, and down here we have a few options, so I can revert to the last saved version of that desktop layout by clicking this option, Reload Current Desktop. Alright, so I'll just make some of those modifications again, close off this top pane. And now let's say I get tired of having to configure this each time, and I prefer this layout, so I can save this desktop as, select that, give that a name. And now we can switch between the preset layouts, and I can switch back to the custom layout that I have saved out. You can bring up a desktop manager window by navigating into the desktop list, and down here you have the desktop manager. In the file menu you have a few options. You can add a new or create a new desktop. You can apply the changes that you make in here or discard the changes. In the options menu you have this option, auto save desktops, which will automatically save the changes that you make to desktops. That is to the relevant desktop files, because these are basically saved out as files. Maybe a better idea to save those out as a custom desktop, or to really only save those out when you actually want to, but you have that option. And next to the desktop name, so in this case our demo desktop, you can save a copy, duplicate, delete, and so on. Alright, so this is a useful tool to manage all of your desktops in one place. You can set the startup desktop by going to Edit, Preferences, General User Interface, and in the Startup in Desktop section, I will switch that to Modeling, for example, since I prefer that. Check out some of the other options, such as Playbar UI. I often set that to Compact. You can also change the icon size and layout. Alright, I'll just click Apply and Accept here. Okay, so if we close Houdini now and we open it back up again, the desktop pane layout should be set to Modeling. Okay, so I'll close Houdini down, open it back up, and as we can see, that is now set to Modeling. And because I have set that to Modeling, it's also going to set the pie menu to Modeling. And so that saves me a few clicks each time I open up Houdini. Alright, because I have that desktop set in my preferences, it's going to open up in the Modeling layout. I don't have to go and set that myself each time. When you press and hold the middle mouse button on a parameter label, slider, or numeric input field, a value ladder appears, which allows you to adjust the value by moving your mouse left or right. While holding the middle mouse button down, drag up or down the value ladder to choose the magnitude. Alright, the value ladder is a stack of numbers representing how much you want to add or subtract, with the larger values typically at the top and the small numbers typically at the bottom of the ladder. Once you've decided on the magnitude, drag your mouse left or right to change the value. As you move the mouse left or right, it's going to subtract or add the value in that numeric input field. Middle mouse button on a parameter name to edit all of the components of the parameter at once. For example, with your Hud handles, middle click in a numeric input field, and again you get a value ladder. Similarly, in the operations toolbar, when you have some input fields, you can also use the value ladder. You can also middle mouse button click on a widget in the 3D viewer. Let's say we want to rotate this object about the y-axis. Middle mouse button click on the Y rotation handle. The value ladder will show up, and now we can decide how much we want to rotate. Same thing if we want to translate the object. Middle mouse button click on the handle. A value ladder appears, and then select the magnitude and drag left and right. And these changes will reflect in the parameters for the selected node. So with the value ladder, we can make very small to very large incremental updates to a property. What's nice about the value ladder is once you have selected the magnitude and you start moving the mouse left or right to adjust the value, you don't have to watch the value ladder or the actual value anymore. Instead, we can focus on the effect that it has in the 3D viewer. And that was a quick introduction to the value ladder in Houdini. We can bring up a node information window to display statistics and information about a node. For example, we can see the number of points, primitives, and vertices on a geometry node. To show the information window temporarily, you can middle mouse click and hold on a node. When you release the middle mouse button, the window will close. You can bring up the node information window in a few ways. Firstly, when you hover your mouse cursor over a node, the node ring displays, and then you can click on the I button. I for information, so that is going to bring that up in a window. You can also right mouse button click on a node and select to show node information. Or you can press and hold Ctrl and then middle mouse button click on a node, which will also open up the node information in a window. With the node info window open, if you click off of it, so if that window loses focus, the window will close. So to keep a node info window open persistently, you can click on the pin button. With the window pinned, we can bring up information windows of other nodes by middle mouse button clicking, or bringing up information windows to compare information and statistics. Again, with that window pinned, it is now persistent, so it won't close when it loses focus. Now, the information window updates automatically. Clicking the pause button will turn off automatic updates. Then if something in the node changes, you can click the refresh button to update the current state of the node. You can click the gear menu for more options and settings. For example, we have the updates section. By default, the info window is going to update every 0.25 seconds. Because that window is currently paused, it is set to manual, so we have to click the refresh button to update the information window. If the window is not paused, you can set it to update less frequently, for example, which can help with performance if you have a heavy network. Click the pause button again to allow automatic updates of this info window, and notice that in this gear menu, the update frequency is set to medium. You have some other options in this gear menu. For example, you can cook and refresh the node. This is useful if a node had an error, and then you clear that error. Okay, then you can come back and then select cook and refresh to refresh that info window. You also have some other options, so you can zoom in and zoom out. Set that back to the actual size. To copy information from the window, left click to select a tile, then press Ctrl C to copy the text, or click on the gear menu and select copy selection to clipboard. You can also add comments in the information window. Down here we have the node comment section. You'll notice that that will display an icon with the node, and so that indicates that the node has a comment. You can also display the comment in the network editor by toggling that down here. You can bring up the node information in a Pane tab. Click on the Add tab menu, the plus button, then navigate to New Pane tab, and then select Node Info at the bottom of that list. And now we have this persistent node information pane that you can dock where you want that. Here, for example, with that node info docked at the top, we can simply bring up the parameters in the network editor with the P key. Having that node info pane tab open is particularly useful if you have to go through and make a lot of inspections, so you have to frequently inspect nodes in the network editor. You have some of these other options in here as well. And as with the information window, we can copy the information from the Pane tab. You also have the gear button, so you can set the update frequency in here. You can zoom in, zoom out, and do all of those things that you can in the information window. And as you select the different nodes, that updates to give us information about the selected node. By default, a node information window closes when it loses focus. To change this, we can go to Edit, Preferences, and Network Editor. In this window, we can turn off Node Info window closes when losing focus. Click Apply and Accept. And now when we bring up a Node Info window and we click off of it, so when it loses focus, it is going to be persistent, it's not going to close off. In some cases, we may want more space for our network view. We may want to maximize that or close down some of the other panels so that we can see what's going on in our network at a glance. For example, I will click here to the left of that center handle on the divider, and that's going to collapse the top pane, which contains the parameters currently. So now we don't have access to that pane directly, so we need to bring up the parameters in some other way. With my mouse cursor in the network view, I can press P to toggle the parameters dialog. Okay, so that is going to bring up this floating parameters dialog, and I have access to the parameters of that selected node. And now to restore that top pane, I can just click on that divider again. You will see you get an arrow pointing downwards, so we'll just click on that and that will restore the pane. Now that option is also available in the Tools menu, so click on Tools, and then you have that right here, Show Parameter Dialog. And it shows you the shortcut as well, so if you're not a keyboard user or you forget the shortcut, that is right there in the Tools menu. Back in the Tools menu, we also have this option to show the parameters dialog when maximized. So when we maximize this pane, it's going to bring up the parameters dialog without us having to toggle that each time. So for example, I can click this small window over here and that is going to maximize the pane. And as we can see, the parameters dialog is up here to the top right corner of the network view. Click on that little pane button again to minimize the network view. You can also minimize or maximize a pane with the shortcut Ctrl B when you hover your mouse cursor in that particular pane. Now again, don't forget about the context menus. So I can right click on here, we have the parameters and channel section. So I can click on parameters and that's going to bring up this floating window that has the parameters for that node. We can reset parameters. So for example, I'll begin with the context menu. You can right click and down here you can see you have reset parameters. The shortcut for that is Control middle mouse button. So you can just press and hold Control middle mouse button, click in that parameter to reset that. That's also for the entire property. So if you have a vector, in this case translate, rotate or scale for example, right click on that, reset, or you can press and hold Control middle mouse button, click on that to reset that as well. Now what's useful in combination with this is that we can make the current parameter value the default. So we can right click on the parameter and make the current value default. Then when we make some modifications to a parameter, we can revert to defaults. So instead of spamming Ctrl Z to undo, we can simply revert that to the defaults as we had set previously. Then we also have the option to revert to and restore factory defaults. So again, this is very useful for experimentation, where we can set some values, play around with the parameter, and then get back to our previous values when we need to. Sometimes when we have a tool active, a HUD is displayed in the scene view. This acts as a helper to show us some shortcuts and things like that. So we have some preferences that we can set for that. Go to Edit, Preferences, and then select HUD. One option that I prefer to enable is Draw Background, which will enable a background which will show up at the back of those icons and text that show up, and that helps with readability. In some cases, especially if you have a lighter background for your scene view. You can also set the panel size. We can also change the background color. So here I'll change the alpha. Maybe I'll set that to 0.4 and click Accept and Apply. And you can see the background that is drawn behind that HUD panel is now a bit darker. It just makes the text in that HUD panel easier to read. While we can edit the parameters of a selected node in the parameter editor, HUD handles that display in the 3D viewport allow us to control a parameter on the node. This is useful if you don't want to switch back and forth between the view and the parameter editor to find a parameter that you want to update. So in this simple example, I have the poly extrude, and we have a few parameters that show up in this hard handle. To move the hard handle, left click and drag in the top bar. You can also resize the hard handle and how that shows up by left clicking and dragging on the edges to the left or to the right. Right click for the context menu. In here we have a few options, so we can lock the position, for example. So now we cannot move that hard handle around. Right click again to undo that. Right click and you have the option to undock these parameters. Right click again to dock all of them, and you have the option to undock the stack or to undock all of the parameters. Now you can move them around. Each one of those is now a separate hard handle. You can move them around and put them where you want them. Now currently we only have divisions, distance and inset. So how can we add another hard handle? Well, let's say we want twist, for example. We can go to the parameter editor and then left click and drag the twist parameter, that property, into the 3D scene view. And as you can see, that will show up. Now we can leave it as is, or we can dock that with the other parameters. And so now we have the twist hard handle, which allows us to control the twist parameter on the node. Another interesting is you can right click in here and then click lock parameter, for example. So now we cannot change that. Same thing in the parameter editor, you will see that is locked. If you try to change that, it's going to snap back to that value. So this means we don't have to navigate to the parameter editor to do something like this. If you want to lock it, you can just do that right here in the hard handle. You can also right click and select to lock all parameters, for example. And again, we can do this without having to navigate to the parameter editor. You can also display a title, and you can double click to edit the title. What may also be useful is persistent hard handles. You can right click and select persistent. You will notice that the persistent hard handle is indicated by this red dot. A persistent hard handle will stay in the view when you switch between nodes. Sometimes they will be grayed out. This happens when you use incompatible tools such as the view tool. So if they are grayed out, switch to another tool such as the handle tool, for example. So in this example, I have the merge node selected. The display flag is set on that, but I can still see that persistent hard handle for the poly extrude node. And if I make changes in here, that is going to reflect in the parameters for that node, meaning that we can update the parameters on that node even though we don't have it selected. Turn off the persistent handle by right clicking on the handle and click persistent again to toggle that off. You also have some of the other options that I mentioned, such as making the current values the default or to revert the parameters to default. Here, for example, I will revert the parameters to the default values. And as you can see, that is going to update in the parameters for the node. I did not have to go to the parameter editor for that. And so again, if you are doing some interactive modeling, this gives you a lot of flexibility to keep working in the scene viewer without having to go back and forth between that and the parameter editor. You can press and hold Control and left click and drag on the top bar of the hard handle, in this case the stack. A red line will appear and that is going to ungroup or undock that top hard handle. Press and hold Shift and left click and drag on that top bar. When we approach another hard handle, that is going to give us a green line, which will indicate that when we let go on there, that is going to dock those handles. And they don't have to be the same size. You can say I can dock different sized hard handles as well. I'll just take this one off again and then right click on it and select delete. That is going to remove that slider hard handle from the viewport. You can toggle the visibility of the hard handles with Shift and F2 if you want to temporarily toggle the visibility of those. It's not just sliders that can be hard handles. You can also have checkboxes or drop-down menus or even buttons as hard handles, and you can dock those with the other hard handles. We can also set preferences for the hard handles, so I'll go to Edit, Preferences, and Hard Handles. For example, we can draw the background. I will enable that. We can click here to set the color, or we can set the alpha, for example. I will exaggerate that and set that to 0.5, click Apply. And we can see the background of those hard handles are now drawn in this darker color. So you can also display the title. Now to edit a title, you can double click on that title. I'll just click Apply here. You will see currently it shows divisions. I'll just disable that. Another interesting thing is you can show a toolbar. I'll enable that. And here, for example, you can choose to pin this, so you cannot move that around. You can lock the parameters, Okay, we've seen how to do this previously, but here we have the ability to do that using these buttons in a toolbar. Okay, so that was a quick look at Hud Handle Preferences. You can bring up a Find Node dialog to find nodes in the network editor. You can bring this up in the Edit menu, navigate to Find Node, or press the shortcut Ctrl F. Type the name that you want. In this case, I have the salute example. That will bring that up in the results section. So I can click on that, and the network editor will navigate to that node and have that selected. Now, if you double click on a result, the Find Node window will close. You can turn off Close on Select to prevent that. For this example, I have 5 null nodes. 2 of their names start with lowercase, 2 uppercase, and then I have one named loot as well. You can turn on Ignore case, and then if I type null, all 4 of the nodes named null will show up, regardless of the case. So then we can do case-insensitive searches. You can click on the next or previous buttons to find the previous or next matching nodes. You can also go to Edit, and then in here you can go to the next matching node or the previous matching node. The shortcut for next matching node is Ctrl G. Previous matching node is Ctrl Shift G. You can also add some filters. For example, I will add a type filter. So the node type is or is not. In this case, I will select is, and then SOP, for example. And then we'll click in this list and search for null. And now these null nodes will show up. I will click on any, and then any null node will show up in the results. In this case, you can also clear the text in the Find input field because it will display those results anyway. You can click on the red delete button to the right of the row to remove that filter. You can also choose which network or context to search in, clicking on this button. So here, for example, you can go to the mat network. I'll just go back to this object context in the box object 1. So with that, you can choose where to search. And then you have a button here to open an additional Find Node window. Alright, so that was a quick introduction to the Find Node dialog. The Dashbox is a window that we can bring up where we can search and find things in Houdini. To bring up the Dashbox, navigate to the window menu, and down here we have Dashbox. The shortcut for that is Ctrl Shift P. There are many options and settings in Houdini, and sometimes it's difficult to remember exactly where those are. So for example, let's say we want to change the background color scheme of the 3D viewer. I will search for that, and then in the display options section, we have this color scheme for the background. You can press the up and down arrow keys to navigate the list. Press enter to select an option, or you can just click on that to select the option. You can press escape to close the Dashbox window. So if I click on that or navigate to that and press enter, Houdini will bring up the display options and navigate to the relevant tab, the background tab, and Houdini will temporarily highlight the property that we are looking for. You can also use the Dashbox to navigate to find things quickly. So for example, a property on a node. Let's search transform, for example, and we can use these hashtags. So hashtag path, for example. And let's say I know the transform that I'm looking for is on this node. So I can navigate to that and press enter. And now Houdini will navigate to the transform node in that object. You can even search for a parameter. For example, let's say we are searching for the scale parameter. So we will do scale hashtag param for parameter. Press enter and it's going to take us directly to that scale parameter with the typing caret placed in that entry box, so we can just start typing if we want to modify the scale parameter. You can even bring up pane. So let's say, for example, I type out material, I do hashtag and pane to filter for the panes. Press enter and it's going to navigate to that pane or bring it up if it is not already in the viewport. Alright, so that was a quick introduction to the Dashbox in Houdini. Work lights are light setups for the 3D viewer. When you enable the work lights feature, it's going to ignore the lights that are in the scene. Right-click on the work lights button and select properties. This will bring up some properties for the selected work light setup. You can change intensity and stuff like that. The headlight is a single distant light. Then we have the dome light, which is a single environment light. With this, you can mimic a daytime sky. You can choose an HDRI for that. If we go to the properties for the dome light, we can specify an HDRI to use. Houdini does ship with 3 of those in the HDRI folder. Here you can play around with the intensity, the exposure, and so on. Physical sky simulates a physical sky. This is a great option when you work with terrain. You have quite a few properties for this. The solar altitude is the vertical angle, solar azimuth is the horizontal angle, and then you have intensity and so on. Down here you can also enable show as background image. Okay, and as you can see here, that is going to show that as a background image. You can see the sun, for example. You can enable and disable the sunlight and the skylight and play around with the settings for those. Next, you also have 3-point lighting, where you have a key, a fill, and a backlight configuration. In the properties for this light setup, you can configure the properties for the 3 distant lights, the color, the intensity, and so on. I will bring up the display options and navigate to the Lights tab. In the lighting section, we can choose between no lighting, which will ignore all the scene lights and show objects at a constant brightness, and we can also select work lights, which will also ignore scene lights, and that will use our work light configuration to light the scene, and the lighting option is going to use all of the lights in the scene to light the geometry. You also have some options for shadows, so you can turn on ambient occlusion, for example, which will shadow objects based on the amount of ambient light that could reach the surface. You can turn on shadows, and so on. In the headlight section, we can choose the light setup. Again, we have headlight, dome light, physical sky, and 3-point lighting. You can also click the light properties button to open a window for the configuration of that light setup. You can enable ray tracing, which will use hardware accelerated ray tracing for lighting and ambient occlusion. Sometimes your shadows can be a bit noisy, so in that case you can enable this denoise if needed. And that was a quick introduction to the work lights in Houdini. We have a MatCap option in the shading mode menu. This will apply a texture to define the shading of the surface. It's going to ignore other material assignments and scene lighting. In Houdini we have MatCap Shaded and MatCap Wireframe, which will draw the wireframe over the shaded surface. But in this case, let's look at the MatCap Shaded. Alright, so this is what we get. We can change the texture that is applied by going into the display options in the material tab. Alright, so here we can change the MatCap texture. Houdini comes with 3 of these. Let's go into your directory where Houdini is installed. It will have $HFS to represent that installation directory, /Houdini, and in the /pic directory you will notice things like an HDRI folder, few pictures and other assets that we can play around with, and here we have the MatCap folder. I will choose this waxy one, and then this is the result that we get.